Welcome, everyone. I'm James Flencher, Regional Resource Director for Caron Treatment Centers in the Washington, D.C. and Virginia region. On behalf of Caron and our co-hosts, Master Center and Mount Regis Center, we would like to thank you all for joining us on today's webinar, When COVID-19 Isolation and Addiction Intersect. I would also like to thank and introduce my co-host, Dawn Chowdhury, Director of Client Development with Master Center for Addiction Medicine, a comprehensive addiction treatment center based in Richmond, Virginia. Master Center offers evidence-based treatment from a behavioral and medical standpoint. Their treatment ranges from medical stabilization to long-term recovery, and out of over 900 patients, one half have been engaged in treatment for over 1 year. Yvonne Capps, Mobile Treatment Advisor for Virginia, sponsored by Mount Regis Center, a level 3 medically monitored residential treatment center for substance use disorder, is located in Salem, Virginia. They provide medical detox, inpatient, partial hospitalization, and an intensive outpatient treatment. We would like to thank our educational partner, CE Learning Systems, for assisting in providing these credits through co-sponsorship with the American Psychological Association. Please note that in order to receive your credits, you will need to complete the post-webinar evaluation. A link will be emailed to you directly after the presentation. After finishing the evaluation, you will have immediate access to your certificate of completion. As a reminder, you must be on for the duration of the presentation in order to receive the credit. We'll be conducting the session in webinar format. All participant microphones will be muted. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your questions before the end of the hour, we'll have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Today, we are pleased to welcome two presenters. Kate Appleman is the Senior Clinical Director of Men's Treatment Services at Caron Treatment Centers. Kate has been with Caron since 2005, has been active in program development, supporting the creation of evidence-based clinical programming for executives, healthcare professionals, attorneys, and opioid addiction. Kate's areas of expertise include men's addiction treatment and recovery, as well as relapse treatment and prevention, motivational interviewing, and working with family systems impacted by addiction. Kate's tenure has allowed her to receive training in addiction interactive disorders and professional development. She is a certified clinical supervisor and a certified advanced alcohol and drug counselor and holds CSAT and CMAT certifications. Dr. James Thompson is a fellow of the American Society of Addiction Medicine and was awarded diplomat status by the American Board of Addiction Medicine in 2013. He has practiced in the field of addiction medicine since completing his training at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine in 2009. He has distinguished himself as a leader and innovator in the development of high-quality, accessible outpatient addiction medicine, culminating in the founding of the Master Center, formerly named Virginia Center for Addiction Medicine, in 2016. Dr. Thompson serves as the president of Virginia ASAM and advises public and private sector organizations on the current addiction crisis. Today's presentation will begin with Dr. Thompson speaking on the topic of broken circuits, what neuroscience is teaching us about addiction, followed by Kate honing in on how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted individuals and families affected by addiction. We have time allotted at the end for questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. James Thompson. Dr. Thompson should conclude his presentation and welcome Kate. There we go.
Thanks, James. And thank you, everyone, Dawn and Yvonne and everybody involved in this event. Kate as well. We'll look forward to hearing from you, Kate. And after I do my best to talk about a very interesting subject, really one of my favorite subjects to study. And I should probably start this off by, before I begin to share my slides, by confessing to you that I'm no neuroscientist, but I'm a real fan of neuroscience. I have an older brother who I'm very proud of, who is a neuroscientist, and I couldn't help myself as I moved through my medical training to gravitate towards the science of the brain and how the brain works, um, and it's such a pleasure and a blessing to be able to work in the field of addiction studies, where I get to not only see the miracles of people's recovery from the disease of addiction, but learn more about this brain of ours and how it works and sometimes doesn't work, leading to some of the most baffling and devastating illnesses that we face today, especially this one that we care so much about here together this morning, and that's the disease of addiction. The things that I'm going to present with you are things that I've learned, some by observation, but mostly by study. And a lot of credit goes to some of my heroes in the field of addiction research, including Nora Volkow and George Koob. And a lot of thanks and credit, I think, if any of you you'll notice some familiar ideas in my talk. A lot of thanks and credit goes to Dr. Kevin McCauley, who is sort of like me, an addictionologist who comes from a general medical field, but because of personal circumstances and personal fascination, has made a career out of studying neuroscience and addiction, and has done some really exciting and user-friendly work. And I highly recommend his talks that are available through his website or on the internet, and the films that he's made, in particular Pleasure Unwoven, his first major breakthrough. Really learned a lot from Dr. McCauley. Never met him, but big fan of his as well. So I'm going to share some of those exciting and interesting ideas as I try to smoothly now open up and share my slides with you. As James mentioned, we're going to try to hold questions until the end. James, would you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Great, thank you. We're gonna try to hold questions to the end, which is just really probably the best way to do it in this kind of a setting, using telehealth, Zoom, to share these things with you. I miss being able to speak to a group of people in a room where I can look at your faces and read your reactions and take your questions as we go, because like a lot of other speakers, my favorite speaking experiences are the ones where I share a few slides, a few ideas, and then we go off on something that you're really, really interested in, and we talk about that. We're not going to do that today. I'm going to do my best to get this complex and interesting stuff across to you in a palatable way and inspire some thoughts and some questions. And then at the very end, maybe we'll get to talk about some of your questions. I know that there's going to be questions that I will not completely know the answer to, but love to talk about this and maybe learn a few things from you as well. As James mentioned in his introduction, I'm the Chief Medical Officer and founder of the Master Center, which for its first 4 years of existence was the Virginia Center for Addiction Medicine. We transitioned to this new name, the Master Center. Really, our formal name is the Master Center for Addiction Medicine, in honor of my co-founder and a real hero of mine and mentor of mine, Dr. Sherman Master, who was a pioneering addiction psychiatrist here in the Central Virginia area. Many of you who are listening, if you're from the Richmond area, probably have memories with Dr. Master, knew him, and knew what a wonderful man he was, a wonderful doctor, so empathetic, and who was drawn to, in the 1960s and 70s, drawn to the field of addiction treatment, really dedicated his career towards the end of the last 20 years of practice, 30 years of practice, really, or more, to treating people with addiction. He was a real hero of mine. And as of this October, after he passed away last summer in August of 2019, we were able to sort of rechristen our program in his name, and hopefully carry forward his legacy empathetic and understanding addiction treatment that's accessible to as many people as possible and that is effective for as many people as possible. So a special tribute to Sherman this morning. As we get started, only disclosures I have to share with you, besides being part of the Master Center, is that I do occasionally speak for the Alkermes company in support of the use of Vivitrol and treatment of opioid use disorder and alcohol use disorder, but otherwise no disclosures. As I mentioned, today we are going to talk about, I guess I should switch to the true slide view. There we go. Today we are going to talk about some of the neuroscience behind addiction, what addiction is, how it happens, but really it's a further discussion of that eternal debate. So I find so interesting, so challenging, about whether addiction is a disease or whether it's a choice. And as much as it might be settled in our minds and hearts, out there in the world among those who suffer from the illness, their families, the people who make decisions about how we should approach the problem of addiction, and everybody in between, it's still very much being discussed and debated. And I think that it's important for us to, as treatment providers, to contemplate this and be willing to ask these hard questions in our own field. So we're going to talk about that, the nature of addiction. We're going to review the evidence that has convinced many of us that it is a disease. And we're going to get into some of the neuropsychological concepts of the basics of that disease, which have to do with motivation and reward. But then we're going to take it a little bit further this time and look at the multiple layers of the neuroscience of addiction that we've been able to learn about and discover in the last 20 years through the work of a lot of the scientists I mentioned before, and learn about how addiction is not just about dopamine. It's not just about the motivation and reward system. It also involves parts of the brain that have to do with learning, that have to do with memory. We're gonna talk a little bit about the genetic vulnerabilities that underlie addiction, and a concept called epigenetics, and how that is not only a vulnerability in folks who later develop the disease of addiction, it is something that can develop during life and be transmitted to the next generation. But then finally, we're going to try to emphasize the idea that stress and the stress response system within the human brain and body has a lot to do with the development of the disease of addiction, in particular, the concept of relapse. And I think that that'll make a nice connection to this struggle that we're all going through as treatment providers and maybe as people in long-term recovery, as we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, the isolation and the stress that so many are under, and its effects that we are seeing today on the people that we try to help and treat. So to start off, the question that we're really wrestling with at heart is the question of whether addiction is a disease like other diseases, meaning something that's out of control, out of conscious control, or whether it's a choice, the result of ultimately just badness. Addiction looks like badness from a very superficial view. People with the disease of addiction do a lot of what we would call bad things. And it's somewhat understandable for somebody who's never seen it up close to just sort of get the impression that addicts are bad people. And it's very unfortunate, because although addicts do bad things continuously, a lot of us understand, a lot of us who have seen it up close or experienced it personally know that that's not at all the true story of what addiction is. But we're gonna really grapple with this question because it's a challenging question and it's a meaningful question. First of all, I think it's reasonable to talk about what others have thought about addiction over time. Like I mentioned, for those of us who see it up close, we know that it's not just an unfortunate series of bad choices that lead to a sad life. It's not just sad, it's baffling. Sometimes it's enraging to see what addiction can do to a good person, to a person that we love, to a person that we admire and trust and respect, even to our own selves. I think that people have observed that over time, and for a long time have come to the conclusion, just based on what they've seen up close and in person, that this could be no kind of conscious decision or choice, but some sort of affliction. Hence the common term that disease is an affliction. And there have been some people, though, also wise observers who in the past have recognized in history that addiction was more than just a series of bad choices. Because what is disease? Disease is a constellation of signs and symptoms that go together in a particular pattern, that start in a certain way, progress in a certain way, and lead to a certain conclusion. And that pattern repeats itself in different people at different times and in different places and circumstances. And that's what we've always in history called disease. Now, when I say in history, I'm talking about the broad scope of history, going all the way back to the very birth of the modern thought or the scientific thought on disease. It really comes from antiquity, from the Greeks. Among those Greek and Arab scholars who first began to base our idea of disease and medical care on observation, there were some famous minds, including good old Pythagoras. He was about a lot more than just triangles. Pythagoras famously wrote his observation that there were some who were afflicted by the disease of not being able to control their use of alcohol, and that this was a disease of the brain. Later in the Enlightenment era, there's the famous signer of the Declaration of Independence, the father of American psychiatry, Benjamin Rush, who wrote a lot about alcoholism, what it was, what it looked like. Abraham Lincoln did the same, as a matter of fact, in a very empathetic way, described what he had seen, how alcoholism had affected people that he admired and trusted. And of course, the disease concept model, if you will, was very much embraced by and popularized by Alcoholics Anonymous. So in other words, there has always been a segment of society in the know, up close and personal, who realize that addiction is not simply bad choice, and it has mostly to do with awareness of the disease or proximity to the disease that has enlightened a lot of those folks. In the modern era, I think that we have now, although our concept of disease has narrowed quite a bit, and that's made it more difficult for especially my colleagues and the rest of medical health, but also just the general public to grab a hold of addiction as a disease like we think about the diseases. But yet there's new evidence that it still is so, including the fact that the percentage of the population that's affected by this disease is pretty consistent throughout time, through the modern era of the census, where we've kept those kinds of records here in the United States and in other countries. About 8.5%, 9%, 10% of the population affected by this disorder. Different types of people, different settings throughout time, pretty consistent, and that's pretty striking. The way that drug use has changed over time, that the popularity and danger of different drugs has changed over time, and yet the pattern of addiction is the same. And that to me has been a real strong evidence that we're talking about something more than just a lack of character, lack of intelligence, or just bad behavior that comes and goes. Of course, the American Society for Addiction Medicine, of which I'm a member, has a very nice, succinct scientific description of addiction as a chronic disease characterized by drug use that's compulsive, difficult to control, and that continues despite harmful consequences. This is the definition I use a lot for my patients as they first approach the process of reckoning with their struggle with drugs. That, hey, it's not about what drug you use, how much you use. It's not about how your life is going, what you have, what you've lost, or what you have going for you. It's really about whether or not you return to some source of pleasure or reward that's hurting you, is hurting you. You want to stop doing, but you find that you can't. If that's the state of affairs for you, you have the disease of addiction. Nicely defined and well taught today, I think, in most schools of medicine. 20 years ago, when I was a student in medical school, it was taught, but maybe not so convincingly. Today, it's much better, and yet still, it's difficult for modern medicine in general and the real body of physicians and allied healthcare professionals to fully embrace the idea that this is a disease that has a biological basis and that can be really treated. And some of that has to do with what I mentioned as the narrowing of the modern definition of disease. In the modern definition of disease, which is about 100 years old, we decided in roughly the 1920s that disease was based on a model of target organ being disordered, causing signs and symptoms. So in other words, like the eye having some sort of defect in it that looked like so and created this elevated pressure in part of the eye versus another part, and then symptoms that followed. And then in the reverse, that treating whatever was that deformity, fixing it, like putting the femur back together and putting some hardware in there to help it to knit itself together, caused a healing process that resolved the pathology. And that became our more narrow view of what disease is. It's helped us to really come up with a great industry for treating disease and getting people better. But when it comes to diseases of the mind or the brain, it's been very limiting, because what many scientists, like the ones that I know and work with in mainstream healthcare, often ask is, where is addiction? Where is the disease? You can say it's in the mind, but the mind, to many of us, even among physicians, is kind of a black box. It's very confusing. It's kind of unknown. You can't see or haven't been able to see addiction in a simple X-ray or even in a standard MRI. Not able to get it to come up in a lab test. So if we can't detect it through our modern testing, can it be a disease? Well, in the last 20 years, or 25 years, I should say, we've made some real advances in certain areas of medical investigation that have helped us to understand that it really, really is a disease, and that that not only have we found clues within the world of genetics, but we've also found visual clues in the advancing science of neuroimaging. Today, what we know of as addiction is a much more complex picture of what addiction is. Addiction truly is not just a disease of the brain, but it's a disease within certain circuits or areas of the brain that work together to make what we call our ability to know what's good for us and to make right choices, or volition. In other words, like in the words of Dr. Macaulay, addiction is not just the disease of the brain, and it's not just about, is it disease or choice? Addiction is a disease of choice. Or to quote Dr. Volkow, addiction is a disease of free will when it comes to the use of drugs or any other source of reward. It is our initial understanding, and my initial understanding of disease, revolved around the idea of the system in the brain that has to do with motivation and reward, or the dopaminergic system. the release of a flood of dopamine in the area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and the process that led to that release. That was the core, and is the core understanding when it comes to the neurobiology of addiction. We now know that it's a lot more complicated than that, and that it involves a lot more systems inside the brain. I mentioned already the pre-existing vulnerability of genetics, and of course that motivation reward axis, but we now know that addiction has to do with memory and learning, has to do with stress, and then it has to do with the loss of the ability to make choice that involves the smartest parts of the brain. And that is the full story of addiction. So in talking about this concept, I thought I would start off with the genetic predisposition that exists in people who suffer from the disease of addiction, and talk about some of the concepts behind it. And we will come back to the idea of the pleasure sense, or the motivation and reward function inside the brain, because it is such a powerful idea. But basically, we're going to talk about how the brain is complex systems of the brain work together to help us make good choices when it comes to drugs and alcohol, how the brain is plastic, how it can be changed by the experience of developing this disease and having this disease, and how healing has to do with a rewiring and correcting of that disorder, and how it takes time, because the brain is very, very complex. It's also very plastic. It's complex and it's delicate. There's a lot that goes into our ability to make wise choices about what we want, what we need, and what we do. For some of us who are fragile because of the or vulnerable, I should say, not fragile, but vulnerable because of the pre-existing genetic factors. For some of us, introducing drugs into that complex overlaying system of figuring out what to do, how to behave so that we have the best results. For some of us, that's just a curveball that really strikes us out, about 8.5% of us. So starting out with the idea of genetic predisposition to addiction, it's often been theorized, as a matter of fact, that this genetic predisposition, which we've known about since really the twin studies of the 70s and 1980s, that it may have been at one point in our evolution as human beings some sort of an adaptive advantage, something about people that is just part of our makeup, so that a certain percentage of us are highly sensitive to new stimuli, to new things, and that we're quick to recognize things that can introduce heightened experiences of pleasure and reward, and that what was once an advantage is now a liability, and that very well may be true. We don't know that for sure. What we do know is that the genetic component of the development of addiction contributes maybe up to 50% or more of the factors that go into developing addiction. So you really are, if you have the disease of addiction, you really are born at a disadvantage. But what we have recently learned, and most of that, as I mentioned, most of the knowledge that addiction is linked to genes comes from early twin studies, and then the discovery of certain gene clusters. What's really new and interesting is to find that although there is no simple gene or simple single gene cluster that if a person has it, they have the disease of addiction, or if they don't have it, they don't have the disease. We have not discovered that. But what we have discovered is that it is in the science of epigenetics that we see a lot of the predisposition to disease. What is epigenetics? Epigenetics is modification to the outer structure of DNA. DNA is like a twisted ladder. There's an outer pole on either side, and there are rungs that connect the ladder, and that ladder is twisted. what's in between the two poles of the ladder, the rungs, that's what makes up the genetic code. It's basically 4 letters repeated in all sorts of different arrangements to make all of our genes that drive who we are and how we grow and what we look like and how well we do different things. But we now know that modifications that are made to the skeleton, to the outside of DNA, can change the way DNA is translated. It can affect whether or not certain genes turn on or certain genes stay off. It can affect the way that certain genes are expressed, partially or fully. And that these changes, these epigenetic changes, can be induced by things that a person experiences in life. In certain disease states, things that we always thought of as either mysteries or entirely controlled by genetics, by the actual information between the poles of the ladder, we now know have to do with events that occurred in a person's life. Anything from an infection by a particular virus that caused epigenetic modification to the ladder, to the DNA structure, to traumatic experiences, traumas, events that occurred in a person's life. Living under circumstances of intense stress can cause methylation and other molecular changes to the outer structure of DNA. And furthermore, what's really interesting about epigenetics is that, as I mentioned briefly before, epigenetics, a change in the way DNA is translated and not translated, expressed or not expressed, can be inherited, can be passed from one generation to another. It's almost like this biblical concept that the events or experiences of a person in their life, trauma, something that they went through that changed the way they thought and felt, can then be passed on to the next generation and the next generation. It actually turns out to be somewhat true. But what's also interesting to know is that although we have seen that certain epigenetic changes that lead to the development of addiction occur in people with addiction, that recovery also has to do a lot with the epigenetics, so that we can transmit the changes in our DNA that led to addiction in ourselves to our children. We can also transmit the changes that recovery made to our DNA to our children. And furthermore, the fact that a person has those different DNA structures or epigenetic structures that lead to addiction, as I mentioned, although they make a person more vulnerable to developing addiction, they certainly don't mean an absolute transmission, and that a different life experience can change them just the way that life experience changed in the person who developed addiction. Furthermore, that flexibility, that adaptability that's shown in a person who develops addiction, the adaptability and changeability of their DNA can also be an indicator of a person with the ability to overcome things, to adapt, to be flexible in the way that they react to their own genetic structuring. But we definitely know the conclusion to take away is that there definitely is a genetic component, that events in life can affect genetics, that can sort of turn on the propensity to develop addiction, and that turning on can be transmitted to the next generation. However, recovery can also be transmitted, and that flexibility can eventually end up to be a real advantage for people who have this vulnerability. The next level that's involved in the development of the disease of addiction when it comes to the brain is that bedrock principle that I mentioned before, the motivation and reward system of the brain. Now, this is the concept that for me, over the first 10 years of my struggle, understanding addiction, then later teaching about addiction and treating people with addiction, this is the concept that really carried me, and it served me very, very well. Most of my understanding about the neuroscience of addiction came here in these concepts. Basically, the idea that there is a center in our brain that we call the nucleus accumbens, it turns out, that is responsible for generating or signaling the experience of great pleasure in our lives, in our beings, and that pleasure area, that pleasure button, can be caused to light up by anything that we do in life that leads to success in life, that leads to happiness, health, survival. Basically, our brains are built so that when we do something that's good for us, that leads to our long-term survival, we feel good. And that by doing that and doing it again, and the drive, which comes from what's called the ventral tegmental area, the drive in the deep midbrain to do whatever it was that we did that caused that reward to light up in the brain, doing that again is what is supposed to lead us to the right kinds of choices in life that lead to survival and thriving. Dr. Macaulay often talks about how this pleasure system or pleasure sense is really not just about feeling good. I mean, that's a loaded word, pleasure. It's kind of leads to thoughts about guilt or indulgence, but really knowing what you want based on how you feel is what makes a human able to navigate their own lives successfully. Feeling a great sense of reward when you get the attention of your parents can be linked to the genetic or the inborn need to have the protection of loved ones. And we know that babies that thrive are those that are well attended to. Later in life, the social impulse to connect with others, to have friends, to please authority figures like teachers and parents who love a child, to be able to set goals and reach those goals, to be able to develop a sense of right and wrong and live up to that, to do things like fall in love and to have a family of one's own and the great reward that comes from that. All of those things are very much are interwoven with this concept of feeling a sense of pleasure or reward when something that is healthy is done, and then the ability of the brain to remember that and to drive that behavior once again so that we can get that reward once again. What happens in addiction is that we introduce drugs into our system that have the ability to mimic that feeling of reward, that feeling that, hey, I have just done something that's really, really good for me. That's good for me in my life. As a matter of fact, drugs, some say, and maybe they're right, drugs have a superior ability to cause that feeling that all is right with the world. Whatever I just did was great, and I should do it again. And that when that experience is introduced, that very disorienting, powerful experience is introduced into a brain that has the genetic vulnerabilities that we talked about a little bit earlier, the tendency to be changed by that event, well, that person begins to be compelled more powerfully to repeat that event and repeat that event and repeat that event. And over time, that person begins to change in the smarter part of their brain, the way that they make decisions, to change the way that they value things in their lives, the way that they prioritize what is most important to them and what is less important to them. And eventually the brain is actually, it's actually been changed, and the value system is flipped on its head to where not only is drugs the important reward that person seeks, it becomes the only reward that person trusts. So although they still have an intelligent brain that is constantly working in opposition to, or at least in a regulatory function to the drives of the midbrain, they can no longer really hear the smart part of the brain saying, no, stop, wait. Instead, they feel driven to over and over and over again do the thing that they truly trust to make them feel like everything's okay in the world. It's this false sense. It's a lie. It's a trick. It makes a person feel like they're doing what's going to lead to survival, but it really isn't. As a matter of fact, it leads to the neglect of all the things that they used to once upon a time do to feel good about being alive. Things like as simple as taking care of your own health, of living up to your own responsibilities and doing what's right, of telling the truth and of honoring agreements and treating people the right way, behaving in a way that is harmonious with the people that you care about. All of that stuff is subverted to the use of the drug. And what we have there is the state of addiction. Changing that, reversing that, is a long and difficult process. And that's the whole concept of motivation and reward. It is very powerful concept, and it's at the heart, or at least at the beginning of the development of addiction. But we now know that it's really not quite that simple. I mentioned the importance these days in neuroimaging. And so I threw in an example of how neuroimaging has helped us to understand this motivation and reward system. What you see here are two images, two different types of images that are used in modern neuroimaging study. The one on the left is called functional MRI, where a marker is used and a computer colors that marker to show areas in the brain that are lit up when a person is feeling the sensation of pleasure. The red area on the left image, the fMRI image, is the nucleus accumbens. It is a part of what we call the midbrain, the primitive brain. It's causing the release of chemicals that make a person feel like that what just happened was great. It felt good. It was even better than I expected. It was special. It was really neat. And it also caused that person to feel like, hey, you know, I should probably do that again. The image on the right is PET or SPECT imaging, and the lit area is also the nucleus accumbens. It shows metabolic activity where that brain is lit up. And so the motivation and reward system really is at the core of this, and made susceptible to change and rewiring by that genetic predisposition. But as I mentioned, there really is more to it. One of the things that we know is that dysregulation of this motivation reward system, this dopamine based system, causes a person not only to get confused about what is important in life, what leads to success, what leads to survival. Dr. McCauley often uses the example of knowing whether or not, while you're starving to death, you would rather have a truckload of broccoli or a truckload of chocolate cake. Instinctively, you know you'd rather have the chocolate cake. But if you were starving and this truck that had come to you was your only hope of being fed, knowing that you like chocolate cake is a life or death kind of thing. It's pleasure, sure, that drives you to want the chocolate cake. But in this instance, it's survival. If you choose the broccoli, you will die. So knowing what you like, what gives you pleasure, it really is a life-saving ability. Making confusion in that system, if you can imagine becoming confused, it almost sounds like a fantasy, but into thinking that broccoli, it tastes like chocolate cake and chocolate cake tastes like broccoli, you would choose the broccoli every time. Now, if you were living in my life and chose the broccoli, it would be very good for you and you'd become more fit and healthy and live. But if you were starving and somehow your pleasure sense was confused and you chose broccoli, you would die. You would die of starvation. You wouldn't be able to live. And that's kind of what addiction is. It's a confusion of that sense of pleasure. But it's more than that. It's also a confusion about what is highly noticeable, what is special, what is valuable, and it's a confusion about what is likely. We've learned by further study that when a person has a disorder in this system, this motivation reward system, not only are they more likely to make the wrong choice about what they value, they're also more likely to make a wrong choice about what's likely to happen. So that if I choose to use drugs one more time, the brain of a person whose motivation and reward system is impaired is more likely to think, I will get a great feeling one more time and it will all be worth it, and I won't overdose, I won't get in trouble, I won't get caught, nothing bad will happen to me this time. And that's part of the illness. That's a further wrinkle in understanding the illness. It's basically what happens in addiction. It's so very real once you understand the neuroscience of it, is that a person develops what you might call a sort of blindness. We become blind to what really brings reward. It's almost like a person who's unable to hear or a person's unable to see. And you don't see people getting locked up or thrown in jail or castigated for being blind. In addiction, we are blind to pleasure. We're no longer able to feel pleasure in the right things, but we have a heightened sense of pleasure and emphasis and importance on all the wrong things. It's very interesting. Pleasure blindness. The next layer that is involved in addiction is something that people who have observed addiction up close are aware of to a large degree. And that is that there is a sense of habit when it comes to addiction. There is a real important factor that has to do with memory and with learning when it comes to the circumstances of addiction and the things that trigger relapse. A lot of research in this area, as a matter of fact, even by very serious people, neuroscientists and philosophers alike, are beginning to look at whether or not addiction is truly a learning disorder rather than a disease in the way that we are talking about it here. In other words, a learning disorder like ADD that is unfortunate, but that a person can grow out of. I don't agree with that conclusion, but there's interesting research to support it. Basically, to kind of boil it all down, is that when a person experiences the powerful reward that I mentioned in the last bit, and the nucleus accumbens area is lit up and that person feels great pleasure, the brain of an addict, and it's different for an addict versus another person, the brain of an addict is able to make very highly powerful memories that are connected with the emotion and the feeling of that reward. In other words, when a person has an addictive type experience, when they feel that reward, that special reward, maybe for the first time, we often think a lot as addicts about that first time and how it's never quite as good. We attach to them emotion and links to time, to place, to people that we were with, to the senses that we were experiencing, the sounds, the smells, the sights, the angle of the sun, what we were doing, the music that was playing. And those things all become hyper memories, special memories that are linked with the experience of the high, of the reward. And what we see in neuroimaging is that these areas of learning, that they're more highly linked to pleasurable experiences in addicts than they are to non-addicts. An example in the neuroimaging study was a study that was done showing two sets of people cues, basically videos that included drinking, where one group of people were alcoholics, one were non-alcoholics, shown the same movie, shown the same cues. Maybe somebody was carrying a glass and it had ice in it and it was making a tinkling sound. Someone else had a fancy bottle, or in the back there was a bar. And the parts of the brain that are involved in emotional memory, like the insula, lit up, and the cingulate cortex lit up in the person with alcoholism, where the social drinker reacted to them like normal stimuli. There was no emotion, there was no special association, there was no flood of memory and emotion like there was in the person with alcoholism. Another interesting study that was done further back in time, back in the 1960s, it started animal studies where mice were given drugs in a certain chamber called the drug-associated chamber, but were free to move about between that chamber and another chamber that was called the neutral chamber, that in every way was just the same as the drug-associated chamber, except that administration of drugs was only given in the drug-associated chamber. And it was observed where the preference of that mouse was. Where did the mouse like to hang out in his free time? And what the study showed was that the mouse overwhelmingly preferred to hang out in the drug-associated chamber, linking the environment to the experience of being intoxicated or having that reward. So very, very interesting studies. Addiction, people with addiction are people who are prone to develop special memories. So memories that link them to that experience, that very special experience. And so it sort of helps explain how later in life, if a person is exposed to a cue, sometimes it can even just be a smell, their mind can immediately go back to that pleasurable experience, and the motivation reward system can be turned on. And the drive to repeat that behavior that led to that reward is turned on. And it may have a lot to do with what we call the experience of craving. It was very interesting. But most of all, today, I want to talk to and introduce you to, and really all of this is just a kind of a bare bones introduction to some really, really interesting stuff, and stuff that I wish we had more time to talk about. But I really wanted to emphasize the idea that addiction also has a lot to do with stress. And there's a lot of research out there that really shows how very true this is. Many of you might remember how the body has a system that involves the brain, multiple levels of the brain, and glands throughout the body that produce chemicals that help the body and brain cope with stress. We call it the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, where the hypothalamus produces a chemical called corticotropin releasing factor. The pituitary releases adrenocorticotropin, a hormone, and then the adrenal gland produces either cortisol, or it produces adrenaline or noradrenaline to help the body cope with moments of stress. What research has shown is that, number one, in exposure to stress, continuous stress, triggers the methylation of DNA, or basically epigenetic changes to DNA. Some of the same epigenetic changes that can cause long-term differences in the way that the organism thinks and feels, including the development of substance use disorder. So exposure to stress of any kind increases the risk that any person can become an addict. If a person already has the genetic predisposition, if the person has already access to and experimented with substances of abuse, stress can really accelerate the development of addiction. It kind of helps us to understand why trauma and stress is linked to addiction later in life. Trauma induces epigenetic change, and that later in life makes a person vulnerable to substance use disorder. Another example is that corticotropin releasing factor, the hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus in stressful situations, causes a downregulation of a certain type of dopamine receptor. And dopamine, as we talked about it in the pleasure sense bit of my talk, has a lot to do with the sense, the ability to feel reward when a certain behavior is accomplished. When the dopamine type 2 receptor is downregulated by exposure to corticotropin releasing factor, it leaves a person in a state of anhedonia. In other words, inability to feel pleasure with normal experiences. Basically, that person feels kind of down all the time, always a little worse than they should. And that, if you can imagine, sets a person up to be deeply impressed by what a drug can do. If you can't feel pleasure by taking a trip out to the riverside and doing some fishing, or hanging out with friends, or watching a movie, you need something more powerful to stimulate that release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And we all know that drugs are the most powerful when it comes to that. And so stress makes a person vulnerable to the impression that drug use can make on a person's brain. Another final really, really interesting thing, and I think I might have a picture to demonstrate. No, I don't. I apologize. Maybe I can go back to this picture. In this area, well, I suppose you can you see my mouse? I don't know if you can, but in the area between what's called the prefrontal cortex, or the cerebral part of the brain, right up here, between that part of the brain and the midbrain is there is a circuit. It is called the corticostriatal circuit. It's basically the way that the smart brain communicates to the more emotional primitive brain. In a normal human function, this circuit from the striatum here into the middle part of the brain usually has a regulatory function. It tells the driving part, the behavioral part of the brain, the part that says, go ahead and do what makes you feel pleasure. It tells that part of the brain to wait, to stop, to regulate itself. Introduction of stress and continued stress actually reduces the connection between those two parts of the brain. And we see that there is a loss of gray matter in those areas, so that people lose the ability to turn off the parts of their brain that say, go ahead and do it. And so stress really makes people vulnerable to addiction, to relapse, to developing addiction. And of course, today, as evidenced in these headlines that I quickly collected, it was easy to collect them. What we've seen in the circumstances of this pandemic that we're going through is a huge increase in the severity and in the number of people struggling with substance use disorder, from alcohol use, from drug use, from accidental overdose, but also to suicide, and an increased reporting of negative symptoms like depression and anxiety. The reason, I think, for knowing this interesting stuff, and the reason why it's so interesting and so important, ultimately is the quest for therapeutics, the quest for new solutions to treating addiction. If you can imagine, if we could introduce a chemical that prevents the brain from creating those hyper memories, those linked memories that are attached to drug use. If we could somehow strengthen that no-go connection between the cortex and the striatum, the part of the brain that says go, and the part of the brain that says, well, let's think about it for a little bit. Let's check whether or not that's the right thing to do before we go ahead and do it. If we could find tools that enhance the joy of natural rewards, imagine how that might be able to help people in early recovery to make it longer, to stay clean longer, to be able to avoid going back to using drugs. There's a lot of potential there. It's very, very interesting stuff. But I think it's also really good to study this, because the fact is that knowing about these things helps us to understand our patients better. And knowledge, it can't be denied, knowledge about the mechanisms of addiction, the biological reality of addiction, really does a lot for a person who's struggling with addiction. It helps that person to understand themselves, to be able to forgive themselves, and to be able to have hope that this disease can be healed and can be overcome. In summary, addiction is a disease of choice, but choice is a very complicated thing. And there's a lot that goes into it that's out of our control. Addiction is a complex interaction between all of these areas that go into making wise and good choices about our behavior that lead to survival, happiness, and thriving. And when those things are broken, you have disease. Recovery, treatment and recovery needs to be a rectification of the system, a healing of this broken circuitry. One last interesting bit in the discussion of neuroimaging, there was a series, and there's an ongoing series of studies of the parts of the brain that are affected by spirituality. One particular study done by a neuroradiologist named Anderson at the University of Utah, where he studied people who were focusing on highly spiritual and faith-building experiences that they had had, meditating on those experiences. And that when they got into a state of religious, faith-focused, spiritually focused pleasure or joy, he scanned their brains using fMRI. And what he found were that a lot of the parts of the brain that were lit were the similar parts of the brain, very, very close to the way that a person reacts to a drug like cocaine, or actually methamphetamine in this study. So the areas of pleasure, the areas of hypermemory, all of those parts were lit up by people having spiritual experiences. And it makes me think and wonder, well, it basically builds my trust in the idea that spirituality and connection have a lot to do with recovery. So I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff there and a lot of hope. So we're going to save questions and answers, of course, to the end. My little joke of a cartoon here mocks the way that we look at the brain nowadays and how medical science tends to reduce things to a very materialistic way of looking at them, when the mind, the heart, the human being is a lot more complicated than that. Here's to hoping that we can take a step back from that very simplistic way of looking at people and disease, and do a better job of understanding, how does addiction happen? How can we really help people to get better? I look forward to the day when perhaps we have a breakthrough in therapeutics that not only helps people to survive, but finally ends the discussion, or at least greatly strengthens the idea that addiction is a treatable disease, and that we should put a lot more into getting people into treatment, getting them better, so that they can thrive and be happy as complete human beings. So that's the end of my talk, and I guess we'll make these slides available to everybody, and I really recommend that you look into some of this bibliography only represents a sort of a sampling of the papers that I referenced in my presentation. I really recommend them to you. Thanks for listening to me. I'm going to go ahead and end my share, turn off my slides, and thank you once more. I hope I did a decent job. And now I'm excited to turn the time over to our next speaker and our focus speaker, Kate Appleton. So Kate, you're up next. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate, I just have to say this before I forget, you referencing Pleasure Unwoven. It's actually one of the therapeutic tools that we utilize in treatment that patients really appreciate. So I need to put a plug in for that reference. So I'm going to hop into it. And as we get started, I'm actually really curious as to who is on the line with us. So we're going to start with a poll so I can kind of understand who it is that I'm talking to. So the question is, what best describes your profession? If you could just take a couple of seconds to identify who you are, would really appreciate it. I'm loving how quick everyone is. All right, we'll just do a couple of more seconds. All right, so it looks like for the most part, we're looking at mental health and addiction professionals. So, so welcome. I appreciate that. I'm always curious as to who I'm speaking to, and I can very much relate to Dr. Thompson. I miss seeing people in person. I get to present to patients up on campus, obviously some in person and some virtually, because I know in Pennsylvania we have a max of 25 to 30 people that can be in any given location at any given time. So it gets a little bit tricky, as many of you likely know. So if we want to move forward from the poll, we'll just kind of hop into this so that Dr. Thompson and I can have a few minutes at the end to talk about some Q&A. So I love this quote. I wanted to put it in here because I think it relates to the spirit of what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to talk about, the intersection between COVID, addiction, and family, and what that means. I'm going to give you a lot of information. You'll get a copy of this PowerPoint at the end of this. Take what you want, leave the rest. I'm very much into resource sharing. I've been in the field for about 17 years, and I'm in a spot where I'm frequently in a spot where I want what everyone else has, because otherwise I stop learning. So in the spirit of that, I'm hoping that you can take some of this information and do whatever you feel like you need to do with it with your patients. So love this quote: nothing in life is to be feared. It's actually only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we can fear less. I have this quote actually up in my office. And it kind of piques my interest and curiosity. And as I talked about, as we move into the objectives, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19, how it relates to substance use and mental health. I'll give you some updated statistics and some things that are happening out there in the country, but also coming back into looking at family systems and addiction. I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing. I oversee men's continuum up in our campus in Pennsylvania, which is about 15 minutes outside of Reading, about an hour from Philadelphia. We'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing. And then also, I'm always a fan of not only talking about the problem, but also talking about the solution. So let's start with the impact of COVID. I grew up, in one of my favorite books is A Tale of Two Cities. And I have here a very famous quote from that book that I'm going to reference a few times through this presentation, because I cannot tell you the amount of times I've read this book. And this piece is so fitting for our current times. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. As Charles Dickens really puts great verbiage to what the times were in that book, I can't help but realize how comparable it is to where we are. We're about 10 months into this pandemic. And one of the things I realized early on was that in March and April, life just kind of slowed down for many of us. Some people who are outpatient providers a lot of people had gone to virtual counseling. Those of us that work in an inpatient setting, it hasn't quite skipped a beat. Patients are still needing treatment and come with us into a treatment setting. And the rest of life slowed down. Extracurricular activities, many schools closed, and there was kind of like a pause in the middle of life. And it simplified things while it was complicated all at the same time. So as we look at everything that's going on with the pandemic, we realize that a majority of what we're going through is really uncharted waters. I've heard the phrase numerous times that we're all in the same storm, but many of us are in different boats. So as we look at everything that has happened in our country, we're in this spot where there's so much that we still don't know. And a little bit more that we do, and starting to figure out how to kind of navigate what it looks like. So as you go to the next slide and we look at kind of those uncharted waters, I put this slide together back in April, the beginning of April. And the truth is, as I look at this, it looks very similar in my mind today when we look at everything that's happening in society and how it's all interconnected. Dr. Thompson did a really good job talking about stress. In a spot where, we have COVID, we have financial uncertainty and unrest. We have everything that's going on in the news and the media. We have politics. There are so many aspects that are happening right now that are making it really difficult for us to figure out how to navigate these uncharted waters. And the truth is, as you go to the next slide, none of us actually really know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing. We've never been through a pandemic before. And I realize that those who pretend to know all, that's what they're doing. They're pretending. I think that as many of us know, we're in a position where we're pivoting and pivoting it again based on new information that is ever changing. Those of you who know me know that I'm a huge Brené Brown fan. I believe in her work. I believe in her research. And I very much appreciate her in many ways. And one of the things that she talks about is this concept that being new at something is the epitome of vulnerability. So we're in this spot where individually, in family systems, in communities, in our states, and in our country, everyone is feeling vulnerable. And as clinicians, based on the poll, many of you are, we all know that this feeling of vulnerability, there's so many pieces that come as a result of that. So when we look at people who feel vulnerable, we look at different defense mechanisms because we feel like we need to protect ourselves. We look at the ways that we respond to fear, uncertainty, the unknowing. And the truth is, none of us really know, but there are a few things that we do know. And if you continue on to the next slide and one more, here's what we do know. We know that we're hardwired to connect. So I think Dr. Thompson did a great job really talking about the importance of connection. And when you look at how we're hardwired as mammals, there's certain things that from a neurochemical standpoint, but also from a brain development standpoint, there's certain things that are just trump cards, for lack of a better term, right? So the whole idea of fight, flight, freeze, those mechanisms based on who we are as mammals, they're incredibly important. So think about the other things as mammals that, keep us alive, the importance of, the aspects of life that keep us alive are the aspects that feel good. If you are working off of an empty stomach and you eat a full meal, your reaction is, man, that was amazing. We think about why things like sex feel so good. We think about why we're hardwired to connect, because we are mammals. We actually survive better in packs. So all of those things are true. And when we think about the reasons why we're hardwired to connect and what it is that we're looking for, if you go to the next slide, the reality is when we look at chemically what's happening for us in the midst of connection, in the midst of spending time with people, when we look at the reality that there's certain chemicals that get released when you're in the presence of other people, when you get an amazing hug by that person in your family that you adore the most, when you have belly laughs with people, that physical connection, it really plays a role in the way that chemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin are released. When I think of oxytocin, I think of the fact that Hallmark has made billions of dollars off of oxytocin alone, right? It's that feeling that gets released when we have the feeling of, the chemical that gets released when we think of bonding and connecting. So in the midst of COVID, we're in this spot where two very similar aspects of COVID and addiction are this cornerstone of isolation. So when we talk about concepts like, motivation and reward changes, the chemicals that are released are different based on the reward. So, part of my background and training is in process addictions. And one of the things that I lecture to patients about in the midst of process addictions is the fact that our brains have more than enough chemicals in them to get themselves high. That's why gambling addiction is a thing. That's why sex addiction is a very real thing. So as we're looking at the different ways that chemicals are released in the brain, not only as a result of the drugs that we're using, but as a result of the interaction or lack thereof that's coming as a result of COVID, this is an aspect that's very real for many of us. If you go to the next slide, the other thing that we absolutely know is that when stress and fear begin, maladaptive coping mechanisms kick in. We know this. We know that through especially the beginning of the pandemic, alcohol sales in and of themselves, they actually rose 55% just in that first week. But then when we look at online alcohol sales, they were up 243%. Now they've dropped since then as stores have remained open. But when we actually look at the rates of online alcohol sales, they haven't dropped all that much 10 months into this pandemic. There's a piece of information from the Washington Post that reported from an article that was published by the Kaiser Family Foundation. It talked about the fact that nearly half of the people out there are identifying that mental health is absolutely impacted by where we are right now. We all know that, right? And I think it's interesting that the more people that reportedly sought treatment, especially over the past 6 months, were coming from regions where COVID was hitting the hardest, according to SAMHSA. So we can find a lot of different ways and a lot of different statistics that really lend themselves to the fact that the two very much are coming hand in hand. Now, as mental health workers or addiction professionals, if you go to the next slide, we have to just, continue to be aware of what are the signs and symptoms that we're aware of and that we know of according to the DSM-5. And at what point does a different level of care make sense, right? So what does that look like for people? How do we help the patients that we're working with and the clients that we're working with really hold a mirror up to what aspects are working and what aspects aren't in a way that's not shameful. Because the reality is when we look at statistically, the amount of people that are over drinking in their homes by themselves is pretty significant. So one of the things that that we've asked ourselves more and more recently is, as mental health workers, we all know what the symptoms of addiction are, but how do we conceptualize what addiction is secondary to COVID? Because one of the things we're realizing is that we have people that are coming in to treatment with significantly problematic drinking and substance use behaviors in the midst of this pandemic. And when you look at some of those initial factors, they don't really have addiction in their family. They may historically they may have not had an addiction problem. But COVID has changed one thing, which is everything. It's changed the amount of times that we physically see people outside of our homes. It's changed our stress level and the threshold of it. It's put us in positions where a lot of the ways that we're connecting with people and the relationships that we leverage are just so incredibly different. And when we look at some of the ways that we spend time, not only connecting with people, but finding purpose and meaning, all of that has pretty significantly changed over the past 10 months. And there is this desire for some semblance of normalcy, maybe not to go back to exactly the way that it was, but just to have some normalcy, feel like we have a sense of what's going on under our feet, acknowledging that things just keep changing and pivoting. So the piece that we therapeutically focus on, just to kind of finish up this slide, is the bottom piece. When values and behaviors don't match, right? What I value and the way that I behave, they're rubbing together. They're not synchronous. So I value commitment, but I don't show up. I value honesty, but I lie. I value fidelity and I cheat. And if you think about it, that's where shame comes from. When values and behaviors don't match, that is the epicenter of shame. And how many times is shame one of those clinical pieces that is right there in our face, in the middle of our office? So how much do we normalize what's going on and help people really acknowledge that they are definitely not the only ones? The other thing that we're aware of is that it's not a tale of two cities, it's really a tale of two epidemics. And Dr. Thompson touched on this a little bit before. So as we look at overdose rates rising by almost 55% in 16 different states, there's also, when we look at overdose rates between March 2019 and March 2020, overdose rates were over 75,000. And when we look at the current rates for the calendar year of 2020, we're very much expecting that we're going to see all-time record highs when we look at overdose rates. Also, if we think about specific to the state of Virginia, some of the things that are actually occurring is that the overdose rates aren't just about Oxycontin and fentanyl and heroin and other opiates, but what they're finding in Virginia is actually there's a lot of synthetic marijuana that's also being laced that's creating an increase in overdose rates. There's also some statistics that are showing that Richmond, we'll stick with the city of Richmond, their overdose rates are over 60% higher than they were last year. So when we look at these pieces, COVID is absolutely an issue in so many ways, and how contagious it is. And there's so many mitigation strategies that we all need to really get through this to the best of our ability. And in the midst of it, this silent piece that, as we have looked at, how much media attention and attention within our field that has been around the opioid epidemic, it has kind of taken a back seat to COVID in many of the conversations that we've had. But if we look at the statistics around overdose rates, it should not be taking a back seat in our mindset because it's gotten so much worse. So there was some statistics that came from one of the leading national laboratories that really talked about the fact that there's an increase in non-prescribed fentanyl by 32% in the urine drug screens that they're seeing. There's also an increase in methamphetamine in the drug screens that they're seeing. So when we look at these aspects, we ask ourselves, well, what's going on out there, right? So the reality is that when we look at continued increase in overdose rates, think about what's happening with our country. There's aspects of our country that are shut down. Air travel is difficult. We've had changes in what's happening in our borders, changes in what's happening in travel kind of overall. Well, that doesn't only just impact people and their professions and seeing family, it's impacting drug trafficking. So as we look at the impact of a country shutting down and then slowly but surely opening up, while it seems like the shutdown over those, 2, 3, 4 months, we should be kind of back up and running. The reality is the drug trade doesn't stop. They don't sleep. And we're in this spot where in those earlier months where there has been a diminished supply, there have been many people who've reduced the amount of heroin that they're using, but they're actually increasing the amount of synthetic fentanyl that they're using. So when we talk about those overdose rates becoming increasingly worse, people are using fentanyl where they think it's heroin. People are going to other dealers as their typical dealers may be out of supply. And they're utilizing chemicals that have a significantly higher potency rate. So that very much plays a role in what's happening in our country right now that impacts the overdose rates. The other piece is, if we can switch gears for a moment, the other thing that we're seeing in the midst of this pandemic, Caitlin, you can just keep hitting next. We're seeing a significant amount of process addiction. So we can talk about pills, we can talk about alcohol, and as we look at electronic use and gambling and sex and exercise, we are in a time of more. We're in a time of more, everything. And I think as life slows down, for those who are kind of already predisposed to addiction, and predisposed to some struggles already related to isolation, it's very easy for addictions to transfer into some of these ways. So I want to just spend a moment here talking about really what some of this looks like. So when we look at the impact of social media and the amount of time that we're spending on electronics, I don't know about any of you, but my phone tells me every Sunday how much time I spent on it. And every Sunday, I feel more and more disappointed when I look at the amount of time that we look at using electronics, but also as it relates to work. I'll get back to that in a minute. So as you continue on, Caitlin, when we talk about high stress behaviors, so we can talk about high stress behaviors as it relates specifically to chemicals, but also I wanted to kind of parse out some behavioral addictions and what that looks like. So as we look, we know that our brains have enough chemicals in them to get itself high, right? We know this to be true. And if we continue behaviors in a way that becomes addictive and is done so in an addictive fashion, we ask ourselves where some of these behavioral addictions become problematic. So the difference between chemical addiction and behavioral addiction is I can drink alcohol or not. I can take heroin or not. It's pretty black and white. in many ways, not always. But when it comes to behavioral addictions, do we ask people, don't have sex for the rest of your life? That's not functional, right? Can we ask people to abstain from food, right? We can't do that. There are things that we need to sustain in our lives. We need to have a healthy relationship with money, a healthy relationship with sex and with food and with exercise, because those all in moderation are really good for us. They're really good for us. So the question is, what has been happening that puts these pieces in a spot that becomes problematic? And many times in inpatient treatment, putting the DSM-5 criteria in front of somebody as it relates to any one of these behaviors and helping them explore those elements, it may not be addictive, it may not be disordered, but what are the ways that any of these behaviors are taking people outside of their value system? And I keep coming back to that piece. How is it taking us outside of our value system, but also putting us in a position where we're not connected? We're not connected to ourselves. We're not connected to our spirituality. We're not connected to others. We're not connected to something to read, please feel free to do so. A Craving Mind by Judson Brewer is an incredible read. And what he focuses on is this relationship between craving and stress and actually smoking and craving for some of these other addictive behaviors. A great read that might be helpful for you and maybe some of your clients. So as we continue on and we look at process addictions, we know that process addictions, they surface in greater times of stress. We know that. And when we look at some of the impact that COVID has had on us and on our clients, we have to realize that when we talk about overeating and undereating, COVID in many ways is such a setup for binging and compensatory eating behaviors. So we're in this spot of really looking at enoughness. And if we look at making sure that our pantries are full, because we have this fear of, are the shelves going to run empty? There is so much that goes along with the feeling that comes along with in March and in April, shelves being empty. Now we're beyond that today, right? Especially in light of where we are at the moment. We're beyond some of that today, but that feeling that comes along with not having enough and the fear of enoughness and what that looks like, there's a trauma reaction that comes with that for many people. And if you think about people who may be in recovery from full-blown eating disorders, or for people who have had issues with eating over the years, there's so much more binging and purging they're not the best foods for us to have on a consistent basis. Caitlin, I'm seeing on the participant chat that the video is locked up. Are you able to see me? Okay. If you can't and it continues to be an issue, please, I'm seeing that it keeps freezing. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to see if I can switch over. Are you still able to hear me? James, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay. All right, I'm going to wait to get a connection. I'm going to continue on, and then I'll plan to call in if it continues to become an issue. Another piece that I want to talk about for a moment is some of the pieces around gambling. So as our country shut down several months ago, a majority of gambling has actually transitioned to online gambling. And when we look at the fact that we're in this spot where there was, I'll give you a statistic, $61 million in revenue in July just on the internet gaming was generated. Now, when we think about what's happening with our casinos had closed down and are now opening back up over the past several months. Well, what's interesting is the revenue with casinos, with in-person gambling, has gone back to almost pre-pandemic levels. But on the flip side of that, or in addition to that, the online internet gaming money that has been generated, that has not stopped. So think about what that means. The money that's generated from in-person gambling, in addition to the $61 million in internet gaming increase, you put those two together, and one of the things that we're seeing live time is the amount of gambling addiction that's coming in through our doors is pretty substantial. The other thing that I want to touch upon is when it comes to pornography use. Pornography has had a great pandemic so far, and I say this. Part of my background is in sex addiction, and the amount of sex addiction struggles that people are coming into treatment with is pretty significant. As you go to the next slide, I was joking around with Dr. Thompson about this before our presentation started. We were discussing some of the ways that we were prepping for the presentation, and I said some of my research I've done on Pornhub. And if anybody knows Pornhub, it's one of the largest pornography sites in the country and actually in the world. Well, they do a great job with, statistically kind of following what is happening with their viewers. And when we look at the increase, I'll give you a little bit of information on this. So there have, in 2020 alone, all right, so we're about 11 months into 2020, there have been 42 billion visits to Pornhub, 42 billion visits. There are also 115 million visits per day, 115 million visits to Pornhub per day. And that in total is 8.7 billion more than last year, than 2019. Pornography addiction has had a great pandemic. And when we, if we go back through and really listen to Dr. Thompson's talk, and we look at the ways that the limbic system really lights up as a result of sex addiction, it's pretty phenomenal. So you ask yourselves, you have people who are trying to maintain healthy, intimate relationships within their marriages. Pornography use is on the rise. People are spending more time sometimes in houses together, but less quality time together. And how many times has that dynamic come across your virtual sessions? That I feel like I'm spending more time with my husband, but it's actually not quality time. I feel like they're physically here, but they're a million miles away. Think about addiction. Addiction is all about, I feel like they're here, but they're a million miles away. So when we look at these pieces, clinically, they're coming across our desks more so than they ever have. We can also look at the fact that mental health, we know, is absolutely taking a toll. So almost half of the people with a substance use disorder also have a mental health disorder. I know where I come from, it's much higher than that. I think by the time people get into inpatient treatment, I think our rates are more like 80 to 85% of the people that are coming through our doors, Caron, also have some kind of co-occurring something, whether it is eating disordered behavior, if it is depression, anxiety, bipolar. We have a ton of trauma that's coming through the doors these days, a lot of addiction interaction issues around gambling and sex and money, a lot of issues around work. When we look at the amount of people that are currently working from home, How many people can relate to your day doesn't begin and end? You wake up and it's really easy just to kind of open up your laptop, and there's no separation between personal life and professional life, because we're doing it all under the same roof. And finding ways to implant some boundaries around that is really difficult for people. So we're seeing all of that come through our doors. As we continue on, I want to skip the next slide, actually. As we continue on, we ask ourselves, why are mental health issues so common right now? And why are they so common as it relates to substance use issues? So we talk about a genetic vulnerability, and as Dr. Thompson had talked about with epigenetic factors and gene expression, there's obviously specific genes and chemical use that are associated with the onset of specific disorders, right? So how many times do we look at the fact that there's certain mental health disorders and certain aspects of chemical use that are like peanut butter and jelly, right? You look at depressive symptoms and alcohol use. Well, yeah, that makes sense because you're drinking a depressant. But also when we look at, the trifecta of that when it comes to nicotine, there are certain genetic vulnerabilities for all of those and how they work together. We think about some neurocognitive factors. I want to talk about developmental factors just for a moment. So when we think about the use of substances while the brain is still undergoing maturation, we obviously know that the sooner people use chemicals, the more likely they are to develop an addictive disorder. So one of the things that we're seeing in the midst of this pandemic is an increase in adolescents coming into treatment. We have adolescents that their job is to figure out how to socialize. And we're in the midst of a pandemic that is really preventing kids from being able to do a lot of those elements in person. And a majority of it right now is all virtual. I have 3 kids of my own. They're 17 and 11 and 1. There's a lot happening around here these days. And the amount of times that they're in and out of school and don't really know what it is to expect is pretty phenomenal. So yeah, when you look at some of the precursors to addiction, we look at the social factors of it, and how we want to use chemicals to relieve stress, to fit in, to do a lot for us. But we also look at the psychology of stress. We look at the biological piece of needing to connect and finding ways to connect and relieve stress, that it all kind of makes sense and creates this perfect storm. If you go on to the next slide, another piece that we absolutely know, and I just wanted to share some of this research with you, is that we know that mental health is taking a toll. We know that there is an increase in anxiety disorders and depressive disorders by over 30%. We know that, according to this study is actually from SAMHSA, trauma and stress-related disorders, as people were polled, this one actually came out in August. Is that accurate? Yes, in August. Over a quarter of the people that were polled were identifying active symptoms of trauma-related, trauma and stress-related disorders. So as we really talk about the fact that stress and trauma and addiction end up being this trifecta in so many ways, we wonder why there's more people that are seeking treatment. Despite the fear of maybe being in a communal environment, our beds are just about full at Caron, because people need treatment. They're not doing well in their homes. And I think that when we look at the fact that we're in a position where addiction is running rampant, and the suicide rates are actually over 48,000 in 2020 alone. Pretty significant, staggering numbers when we look at suicide rates and the exponential increase from 1999 until now. Yet another year that we are much further along with suicide rates than we have in any other years past. And we all know what that's about, right? We all know that livelihood is based on connection. And when we're put in positions where the connection is decreased, things like suicidality and stress and anxiety and depression and substance use, all of those are going to get worse. We know this to be true. The other piece that I want to touch on very quickly is we also have to be really careful. If you want to move to the next slide, we have to be really careful about what information we're putting in front of us. So we're in this position where social media very much reflects our defense mechanisms. And the messages that we're putting in front of us and that we're consuming, we have to ask ourselves, does that increase or reduce the amount of stress that we have? So I'm somebody who, I'm not a huge social media fan. I have some stuff on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook account to see my nieces and nephews and some other kids. And I don't do a ton on social media, but I have even found for myself, knowing the difference, sometimes it doesn't even matter if you know the difference, that my stress levels have increased in the midst of trying to figure out what's true and what's not true as it relates to this pandemic. All of the information around politics and the polls and what that means, I have found and have witnessed in employees, in my family, in patients, that we have to be really careful about what information we're consuming. And when we look at the ways that social media really reflects our defenses, a lot of these pieces feel like they're true for us. How many people are starting to drink at 2 p.m. because they think everybody else is doing it? The next slide really talks about homeschooling and identifying today's fractions. I saw something on the internet not too long ago that we have Common Core math in our schools. And one of the things that people will joke around about is the fact that all of our kids right now, math and English, they're all getting homeschooled by people who are struggling with alcoholism. So what is that going to look like 20 years from now? I see James smiling, because anybody who has kids, that's our reality, right? And that's the reality of other people's kids and what people are struggling with under their own roofs. That's what we're seeing when we're getting on webinars. That's what we're seeing when we're doing virtual counseling. That's what we're seeing when people come into treatment. We're seeing people trying to do the best they can with what they have. And we want to support them in doing even better. We want to support them in knowing that they're not alone in all of this. We want to support them in knowing that this isn't something that's funny. It's something that kids are trying to navigate, their parents drinking too much. People are trying to get prescriptions so that they feel like they can sleep. There's a lot that's happening out there. And I think that's why we're having this webinar today. Caitlin, if you can skip another 2 and one more and one more. So as we look at social isolation, increasing the risk for addiction, we're in this spot where the solution to addiction is not a solution that we're readily able to give to people, right? The solution to addiction, if you look at any research out there, no matter how great of a therapist you are, the reality is a lot of people, they get better in groups, right? That's why 12-step programs work. That's why Smart Recovery and Celebrate Recovery, the ability to really connect them with other people that can relate to them. They listen to them so much better than they listen to us anyway, right? Because the ability to connect is something, it's that spiritual piece that they can't get elsewhere. And we're in this spot where if you think about the virtual counseling that you guys have been doing, we're all working really hard to be able to connect with people. And while they are in a position that they may not physically be around other people, especially in the upcoming months, I feel like the isolation might get worse before it gets better. We're trying to find creative ways to really connect people so that they don't feel alone in their own homes. They don't feel alone in their own problems. They understand that other people are going through exactly what it is that they're going through. So how do we help expand their world while they're not physically in proximity with other people? What does that look like? The last thing that we absolutely know is that families are suffering. We know that. We have a family education program up at Caron that is all virtual right now. We have an education component to it, but then our family therapists and our behavioral health therapists are reaching out to families weekly, just asking what it is that they need. And for many of them, if you think about all of the examples of the isolation that already comes along with addiction, right? I know what's happening under my own household, but I don't want you to know how bad it is. I don't want you to judge my husband or my son. I don't want you to judge me. I want to be able to fix this. I want this to get better. Maybe it's not that bad. It takes a lot for people to come outside of their homes to seek help. It takes a lot. And what's interesting is for many of us, I sit here and I think about Dr. Thompson's presentation. And one of the thoughts I had was, I can't wait till things break up a little bit and I get to meet the Dr. Thompsons of the world and some of the other people that I've presented with and I've presented to and that I've connected with in ways that I may never have done so before. I did something a couple of weeks ago to an outpatient center in Rochester, New York. I would have never driven up there. I think it's like a 7-hour drive for me, but I got to do some clinical work with their patients and to work with their staff. How cool is that? So to a certain degree, what is happening can actually increase the ability to connect with people in a creative way. How many people do you have that are coming to your services that they may be an hour and a half from you, that they would never drive to you once or twice a week? But all of a sudden with virtual counseling, it's right at their fingertips. I think about my 17-year-old has been to counseling probably for the past 3 years or so because being a teenager is really hard for so many of them. And he gets to sit in his car and have a session with his counselor. He doesn't even have to really leave the house to travel anywhere. He can do it from his car right from school and go back into class. So to a certain degree, we look at A Tale of Two Cities and we can think of all of the negative aspects of it. But if we flip the script and we flip the perspective, how are we touching people in ways that we haven't necessarily been able to in the past? Here are some other things that we do know. And I want to run through some of these because I want to keep some time for a Q&A. We know that in the midst of all of this, we're in a spot where domestic violence has increased. The amount of calls that are coming into a children and youth services to report domestic violence has significantly plummeted. For any of us that are in the field, we know that that is not a good thing. That does not mean that child abuse rates are good. That just means that no one's reporting it. What is happening is that the severity of child abuse rates that are coming into the ERs is much worse than they normally are because child abuse is going left unseen. We also know that there has been a significant increase in calls from children themselves to report child abuse because schools aren't always able to pick it up if kids aren't physically there. Sometimes we have a hard time picking it up if we don't physically see them. And we're seeing them virtually. So these are realities. We also know that when we look at high stress behaviors and roles, I really love this slide because as we look at the fact that these are the ways that our patients might be impacted by chemical addiction and behavioral addiction, but the reality is that many of the same behaviors are happening in family systems. They just look different. I say often to our patients that in the midst of all of this crisis, you have a chemical that's somewhat numbing you. Your wife or your kids or your husband, they're going through it with exposed nerves. So of course they want to caretake and enable and fix and rescue, and they're afraid you're going to die. So yeah, they do some pretty crazy things when they don't know what else to do. So these are a lot of the behaviors and the roles that we're seeing. And underneath all of it is on the next slide, as we look at fear, fear looks the same in addicts as it does in their family members. How much do I experience this guilt and inadequacy and anger and hurt? So what we talk about is there's all of these defenses, right? And this noise out there. But the truth is we're all trying to deal with our own ouches. So I've been treating men probably for the past decade and then some. And when we think about the vocabulary of emotions and what little boys are taught about emotions versus little girls, there's certain things that are acceptable and not, right? So the emotion that many times is the most acceptable for boys into men is anger, right? What about all of these other pieces? And the example that I think of is, you know, my daughter is 16 months old, and if anybody has small children, when they hurt, what's the word that they use or the noise that they use? They say, ouch. And many times our language doesn't always, it's not able to encapsulate what that feeling is, what inadequacy feels like, what fear. Can you still hear me, James? Caitlin, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Kate.
Wonderful, thank you. So I just want to end with what it is that we should be focusing on. And I apologize for going in and out. I know that it's the worst part of webinars. So some of the things that we want to focus on, we'll give you the slides around what are some of the healthy kind of things to work on in a family system, and what are some of the things that don't really work all that well. What we need to know and what we need to be letting our clients know is, A, they're not alone. We need to let them know that more people are actually seeking treatment now. More people are seeking treatment because it's more of an issue, but they're also seeking treatment because there is a comfort in not leaving the home to have to take that risk of going to the first appointment. More people are seeking treatment because they don't know how to do it on their own. And I think it's great. I think it's great. People also need to know that we're all doing everything we can to mitigate risk. So I can tell you for Caron, everyone that comes in gets a point of care test for COVID. Everyone gets tested for COVID prior to coming in, because we know that people get better in a community setting. We know that people get better with more connection, and we want to keep our campus safe. And we also know that while there's less connection in person, there's actually more accessibility to care, which is something that I think is really important for people to know. I'm going to stop there for right now. And I want to thank you for being a part of the presentation. I also want to end with, Caitlin, if you go to a few more. As we look at the phrase that comes from A Tale of Two Cities, my challenge is really to look at perspective. I really want to look at perspective because life is all about perspective. We do know that as mental health workers. And when we look at this, the question is, how do we instill in our family members, how do we instill in our clients, how they can use this time to look at pulling out pieces that are the best of times, an age of wisdom, an epic of belief, a season of light, a spring of hope. How do we instill that in our clients? I can tell you that I've grown up a lot in this past year. I've grown up professionally. I've grown up as a parent. I have been in situations that I never in a million years that how many times our spirituality has been challenged in this past year. It's put me in a position where, you know, when we look at hope and what that means for us and for our clients, how do we take this phrase from Charles Dickens, flip the script, and focus on the things that are really important? That's really the challenge that I would have for all of us today. And with that, I'll stop and see if we can open it up for some questions.
Thank you both, Dr. Thompson and Kate. We did get a question, how do we handle positive tests?
Positive COVID tests, I'm assuming.
Correct.
Sure. So one of two ways. So what we do is we have patients come into treatment. They're met with staff who do have full PPE. We actually get our test results back from the labs within about 12 hours. We've also been using a lot of point of care tests that are done right in the patient's car, and they wait for 20 minutes and we make sure the point of care test is negative. If we have somebody that comes in that is positive, we've had one or two people who have done some virtual counseling actually right from our detox unit and can Zoom virtually into our groups. Many people will actually choose to discharge home to quarantine. And once they have a negative test, they'll come back into treatment and actually just resume. It's a good question.
And I have another one. It says, can you go back to the brain chemistry? Explain the color of the pink. Is it mixed with other chemicals or is it oxytocin? The color was not clear. And I'm not sure if that was yours or Dr. Thompson's.
I'm going to assume that's actually Dr. Thompson's slide.
I hate to pass the buck or play hot potato, but I didn't have any oxytocin in mine. I didn't talk about oxytocin at all.
Oh, so sorry.
Well,
can you go back to the brain chemistry and you explain the color of pink is mixed with other chemicals or is it not clear? I'm gonna have to answer that one on the side to understand it a little bit more, Cynthia.
that's fine. We can take that offline. And then one final question, and I'll let both Dr. Thompson and Kate talk about what we are doing for families during this extraordinary time.
Dr. Thompson, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Sure. I would note that, well, a couple of things that are interesting about what we've done in our program and what we've seen happen during this pandemic. We've always had a few different activities that we offer to the families of our patients and families in the community. And when the pandemic hit and we had to switch to a virtual footing, we opened it up and waived the fee for everybody, just feeling like it would be a really needy time and that we needed to open it up to as many people as possible. And we've seen a remarkable response. I don't know if it was it was a nominal fee just for the cost of speakers on a monthly basis for us, but the number of participants has really increased month by month. And actually, it's a lot of credit goes to Dawn, and I think Dawn could tell you more details about it. But we've definitely seen a lot of families reaching out. We've had a lot of family members, community members participating in online discussions that we've been having with different treatment providers and participants in the community. So it reminds me of the days of back in 14 and 15 when the opioid crisis here in Richmond was really becoming apparent and terrible, and any sort of town hall meeting that you put together or offered up, it would be packed. It feels like that now with families here during COVID, because like you said, Kate, people are at home together and they're not necessarily, in doing great things with their time together. There's a lot of drinking, a lot of drug use, and they're seeing it. They're seeing one another kind of descend and spiral. And so there's a lot of worry. Some many of our family members that we're meeting are telling us that they hadn't realized how bad, husband, wife, brother, sister, how bad their drug or alcohol problem was until they ended up at home together during the pandemic. And so definitely seems to be affecting families, and there's a lot of people seeking help.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm seeing some information from Dawn about your next family education webinar. We have the same thing. So we had a family education program that was all in person that has now shifted to virtual. Our children's program has shifted also to virtual. And what we're doing is just a lot of WebEx, Zoom connections. We're also connecting people and family members to alumni families so that they have that connection as well, because we have a regional office. We actually have regional offices in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, Atlanta, New York, a couple other locations. So the ability to connect family members with other alumni family members is something that that has been huge. It's also not just from a family perspective, it's been really important to help clients in treatment navigate through Zoom meetings. And the way that we go about looking at some sober support networks is really helping them identify how they can connect to them virtually, because there is such consistency with that right now, more so than in person.
Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Thompson and Kate, for presenting today, and all of you for joining us. As a reminder, today's presentation is eligible for 2 continuing education credits. Again, an evaluation will not come up directly after the webinar is over. You will receive a link in your email upon finishing. The evaluation, you'll have immediate access to your certificate of completion. Caron Treatment Centers will be hosting 2 more webinars next week. Join us next Monday, December 14th for our webinar on the topic, Don't Panic, There is No Normal Caring for College Students in the Age of COVID-19. Caron's Jonathan Salzberg, Executive Director of College Success and Career Services, will join Kelly Brunton, owner of Ambler Counseling, to co-present this informative webinar that will benefit professionals and parents. Additionally, we are hosting a webinar entitled Empowering Women to Find Hope, Healing, and Strength in Recovery on Wednesday, December 16th. We'll follow the story of 3 different women from 3 different socioeconomic backgrounds, see how they've been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and how their addiction has surfaced as a result. 2 of Caron's top female clinicians will look at these cases live and construct a treatment plan that would provide the best possible recovery outcomes for each of these women. Visit caron.org/webinars for more information, or watch your email for details on how to sign up. Please reach out to your local regional resource director at any time for additional information, resources in your area, or questions regarding admissions to any of Caron's programs. Thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon, and hi, Mom.